Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The storm broke the moment the king's war horns sounded from the valley. Rain fell in thick silver sheets, turning the dust of the capital's grand square into a slick, hungry mud. It was a sky for omens, a sky for endings. For 3 years, Ardell Fenwright had lived under a sky of muted gray, her world leached of color the day Tavian Marrow vanished. She had come to the square to honor a king's victory, but the wind carried the scent of a ghost, and her wolf, a creature of silent grief, paced the cage of her ribs with a restlessness that tasted of fear. She stood apart from the jostling crowds, her fine wool cloak a stark gray against the vibrant banners of the great packs. At 27, Ardell was a woman forged in council rooms and on campaign maps. Her mind was her weapon, her strategies the shield of the kingdom. They called her the Fenwright Fox, a name earned through cold logic and an unnerving ability to predict an enemy's move 3 steps ahead. But logic had no answer for the hollow ache where her mate Bond used to be. A frayed and severed tether that whispered of a death no one had ever confirmed. Everyone else had moved on, accepting Tavian as another brave soul devoured by the border wars. Ardell had simply learned to function around the wound. The crowd's roar deepened, a primal wave of sound that vibrated through the stone beneath her feet. He was here, King Roderick Valahurst. His stallion, a beast of shadow and thunder, picked its way through the mud, its head high. The king himself was a figure carved from the mountain's heart, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with the silver of hard years and harder battles. A fresh scar, a jagged line of raw pink, cut from his temple to the hard line of his jaw. He rode with an aura of absolute stillness, a predator's calm that silenced the cheering masses more effectively than any command. His scent rolled over them all: winter pine, cold iron, and the electric ozone of a storm about to break. It was the scent of power, of dominance, of a king who had bled for his crown and expected nothing less from his subjects. Ardell inclined her head in a gesture of respect, her strategist's mind automatically cataloging the state of his honor guard. Weary but disciplined, their armor dented, their gazes sharp. She noted the heavy supply wagons, the grim-faced healers. Victory was never clean. She knew its cost better than anyone. Her eyes scanned the returning warriors, a painful, familiar habit, searching for a face she knew she would not find. A ghost of a smile, the warm umber of eyes that had once promised her a lifetime of sunrises. The ache in her chest sharpened into a familiar blade. Then she saw the chain. It was thick and rusted, a serpent of black iron glinting in the rain. It snaked from the pommel of King Roderick's saddle back to a figure stumbling behind the warhorse, a prisoner. This was not unusual. War yielded captives. But the crowd's celebratory noise faltered, shifting into murmurs of curiosity and contempt. The man was a ruin, caked in mud from head to foot, his clothes little more than rags clinging to a gaunt frame. His head was bowed, a tangle of dark, matted hair obscuring his face. He walked with a limp, his bare feet sinking into the cold muck, the iron cuff on his wrist a brutal weight. A cold dread, sharp and illogical, coiled in Ardell's stomach. It was nothing. A nameless enemy soldier, broken and defeated, being made an example of. Yet her wolf, the quiet, grieving wolf that had slept for 3 years, suddenly rose up and snarled. It clawed at the walls of her soul, desperate, frantic. An unfamiliar scent wove through the rain and iron and mud, faint, buried, but agonizingly familiar. River reeds, sun-warmed stone, and a deep, earthy musk that was so intrinsically Tavian it stole the breath from her lungs. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. It was a phantom, a trick of memory and grief. Her mind was playing cruel games. Tavian was gone, dead in a border skirmish, his body lost to the wilds. The official report had been clear. The king reined in his horse at the center of the square, his gaze sweeping over his people, impassive and commanding. The prisoner stumbled to a halt behind him, his body trembling with exhaustion. And then, as if feeling the inferno of her stare, the man lifted his head. The world stopped. The roar of the crowd, the drumming of the rain, the frantic beat of her own heart. It all fell away into a cavern of absolute silence. The face was thinner, etched with lines of suffering she had never seen, a pale scar bisecting one eyebrow. His hair was longer, wilder, but the eyes were the same. A warm, deep umber, like the forest floor after a summer rain. And they were fixed on her, burning with a desperation that was a physical blow, a plea and a warning and a lifetime of love all packed into one soul-shattering look. Tavian. Her Tavian. Ardell forgot where she was. She forgot the king, the crowds, the 3 years of disciplined mourning. She was no longer the Fenrite fox, the strategist. She was just a she-wolf, whose mate had been torn from the grave and returned to her in chains. A strangled sound escaped her throat, a name that was half sob, half prayer. Tavian, she moved. Her feet were numb, her body acting on an instinct more profound than thought. The crowd parted before her, a sea of shocked faces turning from the prisoner to her. She heard gasps, whispers. The royal guard tensed, hands moving to the hilts of their swords, but they did not stop her. No one dared. Her grief was a legend in the capital, a quiet, dignified tragedy. This was something else entirely. This was a miracle wrapped in a nightmare. She reached him, her boots sinking into the mud beside his. The rain plastered her golden hair to her cheeks, but she didn't feel the cold. All she could feel was the magnetic pull of the bond she thought had been severed, now flaring to life with an agony of renewed hope. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the cold, wet iron of the chains that bound him. Beneath the metal, his skin was warm, alive. Ardell, he breathed, and his voice was a raw, broken thing, a sound of rust and ruin. But it was his. Her fingers curled around his chained wrist, a desperate anchor in a world that had just tilted off its axis. Tears mixed with the rain on her face. "You're alive," she whispered, the words clumsy, inadequate. They said, "Everyone said you were dead." His eyes, those beautiful umber eyes, never left hers. They held a universe of pain, but they held her, too. He leaned closer, his breath ghosting over her skin, his body straining against the chain that held him tethered to the king's saddle. The king watched them, his face an unreadable mask of granite, his scarred eye seeming to gleam in the stormlight. Tavian's gaze flickered for a barest second to the impassive monarch, and a new emotion flared in their depths. Pure, undiluted fear, not for himself, for her. He leaned in until his lips were almost at her ear, the movement costing him a grunt of pain as the chain pulled taut. His whisper was a thread of sound, so quiet she felt it more than heard it, a vibration that went straight to the marrow of her bones and froze the blood in her veins. "Don't trust him, Ardell," he rasped, his voice trembling with a terrifying urgency. She stared at him, confused, her heart hammering a wild, erratic rhythm against her ribs. His eyes bored into hers, pleading with her to understand. "King Roderick Valahurst, he ordered my disappearance." The words hung in the rain-soaked air between them, a poison that seeped instantly into the marrow of Ardell's bones. He ordered my disappearance. The world, which had contracted to the space of a single breath, rushed back in with a deafening roar. The rain, the shifting crowd, the stomp of a war horse's hoof in the mud. And the king. Always the king. King Roderick Valahurst dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. The leather of his saddle creaked, a sound as final as a closing cell door. He landed silently in the mud, his presence a vortex that pulled all attention, all air towards him. He didn't look at Tavian. His gaze, a heavy weight of stone and ice, settled on Ardell. There was no anger in his eyes, no shock. There was something far worse, a profound calculated pity that made her skin crawl. "Strategist Fenright," he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the storm effortlessly. "Step away from the prisoner." It wasn't a request. It was the rearrangement of reality. Her hand, still curled around Tavian's chained wrist, felt suddenly cold, the warmth of his living skin a fleeting memory. Her wolf snarled, a primal command to hold on, to shield, to fight. But the strategist, the woman who had survived 3 years by caging that wolf, took control. Releasing Tavian felt like tearing a part of her own soul away. His eyes widened, a flicker of betrayal in their depths, before he masked it with a stony resignation. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "This man. He is Tavian Marrow, my mate. He was declared dead." "I am aware of who he was," the king replied, his tone chillingly precise. He took a step closer, and the scent of pine and cold iron was suffocating, blotting out the faint, precious scent of Tavian. "We found him in the Shadowfen marshes, living among a nest of insurgents who have been bleeding our supply lines for a year. He was not their captive, Ardell. He was one of them." The lie was so bald, so audacious, that it stole her breath. Tavian, a traitor? Tavian, whose loyalty to the Pax was as ingrained as his own bones? It was unthinkable, ludicrous. Yet as her gaze swept the square, she saw the seed of doubt the king had planted already taking root. The whispers changed their tenor, shifting from shock to suspicion. A hero's lost mate was a tragedy. A traitor's return was a disgrace. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head, the rain dripping from the ends of her hair. "He would never." 3 years in the wild breaks a man," Roderick interrupted, his voice laced with that terrible false sympathy. "It breaks his mind. He has been telling us wild tales since his capture, delusions, paranoia. He accuses good men of treason and claims phantoms ordered his fate." The king's scarred eyes seemed to darken. "The man you knew is gone, Ardell. This is what is left." He gestured to the 2 guards who had moved to flank Tavian. "Take him to the black cells. The healers will see to his injuries, and the interrogators will see to his memory." "No!" The word was torn from her, raw and instinctive. Tavian's head jerked up, hope warring with despair in his gaze. The king's expression hardened for the first time, a flicker of the true predator beneath the crown. "Do not make a scene, strategist. Your grief is understandable, your interference is not." He turned his back on her, a dismissal more absolute than any blow, and addressed the crowd. "A great victory has been won today, but the war is not over. There is poison within our own lands that must be purged. Tonight we feast, tomorrow we cleanse." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd, eager to believe the simple narrative of a king's victory over the more complicated, messy truth standing before them. The guards grabbed Tavian's arms. He didn't struggle, but his eyes locked with Ardell's one last time. They were screaming a message she couldn't decipher, a frantic, silent plea that clawed at her heart. "Believe me, please, believe me." Then they dragged him away, his limp more pronounced, his body a broken silhouette against the gray stone of the fortress gate. He disappeared into the maw of the castle, and the bond, which had flared so brightly, felt stretched and thin again. A thread of agony pulled taut across an impossible distance. Someone touched her elbow. It was Corbin, the king's beta, his face a mask of grim duty. "Come, Lady Ardell, you are soaked through. Let's get you out of the rain." She allowed herself to be led away, her mind a maelstrom. Every instinct, every fiber of her being, screamed that Tavian was telling the truth. But her logical mind, the cold, calculating part of her that had won battles, was struggling. The king's story was plausible. A man lost and tortured could break. He could turn. To accuse the king himself was the act of a desperate or insane mind. King Roderick was a hard ruler, but he was fiercely protective of his people, his warriors. Why would he discard a valuable scout like Tavian? For what purpose? It made no strategic sense. The whispers followed her through the great stone halls of the citadel. The courtiers and pack elders who hours ago would have sought her counsel now averted their eyes. Their scents were sharp with curiosity, suspicion, and a cloying dose of pity. She was no longer just the Fenrite fox, the brilliant strategist. She was now connected to the king's prisoner, tainted. Her chambers were a refuge of cold stone and stark functionality. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She shed her wet cloak, her movements stiff and mechanical. She stood before the hearth, watching the flames devour the wood, her mind replaying the scene in the square. Tavian's eyes. The fear in them had not been the fear of a madman. It had been lucid, sharp, and it had been for her. She ran a hand through her damp hair, pacing the length of the worn Eisenwood rug. She remembered the last night she'd seen him. They had been in this very room. He was due to leave at dawn for a 3-day patrol of the northern border. He'd held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head, his scent of river reeds and warm earth a comforting blanket. "Come back in one piece, Marrow," she had teased, her voice muffled against his chest. He had laughed, a low, warm sound. "Always, Fenrite. There's nowhere else I'd rather be." There had been no fear in him, no premonition. He was a man utterly content, deeply in love and loyal to his core. What could have happened in the space between that dawn and his disappearance? A border raid, the official report had said. His patrol was ambushed. No survivors, no bodies recovered. A clean, tragic story. But Tavian's whisper had just ripped that story to shreds. He ordered it. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. She schooled her features into a neutral mask before calling, "Enter." It was Corbin again? He entered with 2 goblets of mulled wine on a small silver tray, the steam rising in fragrant clouds of cinnamon and clove. He was a broad, powerfully built wolf, his face a roadmap of old battles, but his eyes were intelligent and shrewd. He was the king's shadow, his unwavering right hand. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He set the tray down on a small table. "The king is concerned for you, Ardell. He understands what a shock this must be." "It is," she said, her voice carefully measured. She accepted the goblet he offered, its warmth a small comfort against her icy hands. "Roderick feels a certain responsibility," Corbin continued, watching her over the rim of his own goblet. "Finding your mate in such a state, it is a grim duty. We had hoped he was dead, for your sake. A clean death is better than this corruption." The word was a well-aimed dart. "You truly believe he is a traitor?" Ardell asked, keeping her gaze fixed on the swirling wine. "The evidence is damning," Corbin said smoothly. "He was armed with insurgent weapons. He fought against our warriors when they stormed the camp. He has a wound from a Valhurst blade to prove it. He speaks of conspiracies that make no sense." "Ardell?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "The king values you, your mind, your loyalty. He would not want to see you destroyed by the delusions of a broken man. Do not let this ghost poison the life you have built." It was a warning, wrapped in the silken cloth of concern. "Choose your side carefully." "My life," Ardell said, a bitter taste in her mouth, "has been a ghost for 3 years. Forgive me if I need a moment to reconcile the man I saw in chains with the traitor you describe." Corbin nodded slowly, his eyes sharp. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The feast is in 2 hours. The king expects you to be there. A show of unity is important right now." He placed his empty goblet back on the tray. "Stability is everything, Ardell. The Pax look to you as much as they look to the throne. Remember that." He left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence he left in his wake was heavier, more threatening than the noise of the storm. Stability, unity, loyalty. These were the words they used to build cages. Her hand tightened on the goblet. They wanted her to stand by the king, to publicly accept his narrative, to condemn Tavian with her silence. And if she refused, the Fenrite fox was a valuable asset, but no asset was indispensable. Her wolf, caged for so long by grief and duty, was now pacing with a ferocious, angry energy. It cared nothing for politics or strategy. Its mate was alive, its mate was in danger, its mate had been wronged. All other considerations were dust. Her mind finally aligned with her heart. She didn't know how or why, but she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that Tavian had spoken the truth. The king had lied, and she would not let him be buried in the darkness of the black cells. A new fire burned in her veins, melting the ice. The strategist was awake now, not in service to the king, but for a singular, dangerous purpose. She would get to Tavian. She would get the full story, and she would unravel the king's lie, thread by damning thread. As she set her goblet down, her eyes swept her chambers, her mind already forming the first fragile strands of a plan. Her gaze fell upon the small writing desk near the window. Everything was in its place, her inkwell, her quills, the neat stack of parchment. But something was wrong. A faint, almost imperceptible scent hung in the air right there, a scent that did not belong. It was out of place amidst the familiar smells of paper, ink, and drying herbs. She moved closer, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy drum. She leaned over the desk, inhaling deeply. Her blood ran cold. It was unmistakable, faint but clear, winter pine and cold iron, the scent of the king. He hadn't sent Corbin to deliver his message. He had delivered it himself. Sometime while she was in the square, he had been here, in her private space, standing right where she now stood. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of absolute power. I can go anywhere. I can touch anything. I am always watching. The king's scent was an invasion. It clung to the air by her desk, a territorial marking that staked a claim on her last remaining sanctuary. Ardell stood motionless for a long moment, letting the initial shock recede, replaced by a wave of crystalline, cold fury. This was not just a warning. This was a violation meant to unnerve her, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy. It was a move designed to make her feel small, exposed, and powerless. He had miscalculated. The Fenrite fox did not cower when cornered. She bit. Her mind, a well-oiled machine of strategy and consequence, began to move. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fear was a fire she had to bank, turning its heat into fuel. She smoothed down the front of her simple wool dress, her movements becoming deliberate, precise. First, assess the board. The king held all the powerful pieces: Tavian, the narrative, the loyalty of the Pax. Her only piece was the truth, and it was a piece he was determined to keep hidden. Therefore, her objective was not to challenge him openly. That would be suicide. Her objective was to gather intelligence. And the only source of intelligence that mattered was currently locked in the Citadel's black cells. She had 2 hours until the feast. 2 hours to transform from a woman reeling from a ghost return into the composed, respected strategist the court expected to see. Her performance tonight had to be flawless. She needed to be seen as grieving, confused, perhaps even willing to accept the king's version of events. She needed to be pitied, not feared. Pity would make them careless. She went to her wash basin, the cold water a shock against her skin. As she washed her face, she studied her reflection in the small, polished silver mirror. Her eyes, usually a clear, sharp gray, were shadowed with turmoil. Good. Let them see the toll. Let them think she was breaking. She braided her damp golden hair into a severe coronet, a style she wore when deep in thought, a visual signal of the strategist at work. Tonight it would serve as armor. She chose her gown with equal care, a deep charcoal gray, the color of mourning, impeccably tailored but devoid of any ornamentation. It was a costume of quiet dignity and sorrow. When she entered the great hall, the feast was in full sway. The cavernous space was a riot of sound and scent, the roar of 100 conversations, the stomp and clap of a celebratory dance, the thrum of drums beating a martial rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of roasting boar, wood smoke, and spilled ale. Torches guttered in their sconces, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the high stone walls, making the ancient tapestries of pack hunts and legendary battles seem to writhe with life. Heads turned as she entered. The music faltered for a beat. The whispers followed her like a physical wake as she moved through the throng of bodies. She kept her head high, her expression carefully neutral, a mask of weary composure. She was aware of every gaze, every subtle shift in posture from the pack alphas and their families who lined the great tables. She was a problem they didn't know how to solve, a living piece of a story that didn't fit. Elder Maeve of the Silver Creek pack caught her eye, her wrinkled face a mixture of sympathy and concern. Maeve had known Ardell's parents, had seen her grow from a sharp-witted girl into the kingdom's most formidable mind. The old she-wolf gestured to an empty space on the bench beside her. Ardell gave a grateful nod and made her way over, ignoring the way Corbin's watchful eyes followed her from his place at the king's side. "Child," Maeve said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. She placed a gnarled, warm hand over Ardell's. "This is a cruel turn of fate." "Fate is rarely kind, Elder," Ardell replied, her voice soft. "They say he has lost his mind," Maeve murmured, leaning closer. "That the wild has claimed him? Is it true?" Ardell looked into the old wolf's eyes, searching for an ally, but she saw only a deep, weary desire for peace, for the stability the king offered. Maeve wanted to believe the simple story because the alternative was too terrifying. War had cost them all too much. To imagine a rot at the very heart of the kingdom was a thought too heavy to bear. "I do not know what to believe," Ardell said, choosing her words with surgical precision. It was the truth, but a truth that allowed others to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. "The man I saw in the square, he wore my mate's face, but his eyes—" She let her voice trail off, a performance of pained confusion. Maeve squeezed her hand. "The king will handle it. Roderick is hard, but he is just. Trust in your alpha, child. He will see this through. Trust in your alpha." The words were a bitter pill. Her gaze was drawn, against her will, to the head table. King Roderick sat upon his carved throne of dark wood and iron, a giant among wolves. He was laughing at something one of his warriors said, his head thrown back, the torchlight catching on the silver in his hair and the jagged line of his new scar. He looked every inch the victorious king, the protector of his people, a liar, a monster hiding in plain sight. As if feeling her stare, his laughter died. His head turned and his eyes found hers across the crowded, noisy hall. The distance melted away. For a moment, they were the only two people in the room. There was no pity in his gaze now, no false sympathy. It was a look of pure, unadulterated assessment. A predator sizing up a threat. He was gauging her, testing the strength of her will, searching for the cracks in her composure. She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. She would not let him see her fear. She would not let him see her hate. He lifted his great silver goblet in a mock toast to her, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It was a silent acknowledgement of his visit to her rooms, a taunt and a dare. She gave a slow, deliberate nod in return, a gesture that conceded nothing, before turning her attention back to the table. The battle had been joined. For the next hour she played her part. She ate little, drank sparingly, and spoke only when spoken to, her answers brief and subdued. Her mind, however, was a whirlwind of activity. She watched the guards, noting their patrol routes, the changing of the watch. She catalogued who drank heavily, whose attention was wandering. The keys to the black cells were held by the warden, a grim, scarred wolf named Boren, who sat near the hearth, his heavy iron ring of keys visible at his belt. Getting them from him would be impossible. Therefore, she needed another way in, a favor, a debt, a weakness. Her mind sorted through the roster of the Citadel Guard, the hundreds of faces and names she had memorized. Most were loyal to the king first and foremost, but some had older loyalties. Kalen, a young guard, barely 20. His family was from the Fenright's ancestral lands. His father had served under her own father. And years ago, when the blighted rot had swept through the lower farmlands, it was Ardell's mother, a skilled healer, who had sat with Kalen's younger sister for 3 days and 3 nights, brewing remedies and refusing to leave her side until the fever broke. The family owed the Fenrights a debt of life, a debt Kalen had acknowledged himself, his face earnest and full of youthful honor the first time he'd been assigned to the Citadel. He was her best, and perhaps only, chance. She felt a tremor through the floorboards, a faint distant vibration that no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a thrum of pure, desperate rage that traveled from the stone deep within the earth up into her soul. It was Tavian. He was awake, and he was fighting his confinement in the only way he could. Her wolf rose to answer, a low growl building in her chest. She pushed it down, forcing herself to breathe. She closed her eyes for a second, focusing all her will, all her love, and sent it down into the darkness, a silent whisper through the frayed threads of their bond. I am here. I believe you. Hold on. The feeling subsided, leaving behind a hollow ache. It was enough. It had to be. Ardell rose from the bench, placing a hand on Maeve's arm. Elder, forgive me. The noise. It is too much. I need some air. Of course, child. Go, Maeve said, her expression softening with pity. It was working. Ardell moved toward the exit, keeping her head bowed, her shoulders slightly slumped, the very picture of a woman overcome. She felt Corbin's eyes on her back again, but she didn't look back. She slipped out of the great hall into the relative quiet of a torchlit corridor. She knew Kaelin's post was the west gallery, overlooking the inner courtyard. A cold, lonely watch. She found him there, pacing the stone walkway, his silhouette framed by a high-arched window, showing a sliver of storm-cleared sky and a single, brilliant star. He stiffened when he saw her, his hand going to the hilt of his sword before recognizing her and snapping to attention. Lady Ardell, he said, his young face etched with surprise and concern. Should you not be at the feast? I needed to walk, Kaelin, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She stopped before him, looking directly into his eyes. They were honest eyes, a clear hazel, but they were a soldier's eyes too, trained to obey. My family and I, we were sorry to hear the news of Lord Tavian, he said, his voice dropping respectfully. To have him back, but in such a state, the gods are cruel. The gods have nothing to do with this, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The time for performance was over. Kaelin, your family owes mine a debt. He straightened, a flicker of understanding and fear in his gaze. A life debt. We have never forgotten what your mother did for Alara. I am calling it in, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She hated doing this, hated using this sacred obligation, but Tavian's life was on the line. I need to get into the black cells. I need to speak with him. The color drained from his face. He took a half step back, his eyes darting down the empty corridor as if the stone walls themselves were listening. Lady, what you ask is impossible. It is treason. Warden Boren would have my head on a spike before sunrise. Boren is half drunk on victory wine, and his relief is not due for another hour. There is a service tunnel behind the ale stores. It emerges in the lower passageway near the solitary cells. Your father told me stories of it when I was a child. You know the one I mean. He paled further, swallowing hard. He knew, of course he knew. Even if I could get you there, to be caught. I need 5 minutes with him, Kaelin, she pressed, stepping closer, her voice a low, urgent plea. The king says he is a traitor. I need to hear it from his own lips. I need to know the truth before they silence him for good. Is that too much to ask for the life of your sister? He was torn, his loyalty to the crown, to his alpha, warred with the deep, abiding debt to her family. His hand trembled where it rested on his sword. He stared at her, his young face a mask of anguish. She could see the calculations in his eyes, the weighing of honor against survival. He was my father's friend, he whispered, his voice cracking. But the king is my alpha. An alpha's command is law, Ardell acknowledged, her voice a soft, dangerous counterpoint to his fear. But a life debt is blood. It is soul. Law can be broken, Kaelin. Blood cannot. She held his terrified gaze, letting the weight of her words, the truth of them, settle deep into his bones. This was the most critical move she had ever made, more perilous than any battle strategy. She wasn't deploying troops. She was wagering a young man's life on a ghost of a chance. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the single star, visible through the gallery window. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, broken only by the distant sounds of the feast and the frantic beating of her own heart. She had played her card. Now all she could do was wait for it to fall. When he finally turned back to her, The fear was still in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a grim resolve. He had made his choice. The service tunnel is kept locked. The key is on Boren's ring. Ardell's hope plummeted. It was an impossible checkmate. But Kalen continued. His voice barely a whisper. There is a spare, hidden behind a loose stone in the east cellar wall for emergencies. My father showed it to me once when I was a boy. He said a good soldier always has a back door. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I will not open the tunnel for you, lady. But I will look the other way for 10 minutes. I will patrol the upper courtyard and see nothing, hear nothing. What you do with that time is your own affair. But if you are not back before the watch changes, I can do nothing for you. You will be on your own. Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over her. It was more than she'd had a right to ask for. Thank you, Kalen, she breathed. The words wholly inadequate. Your family's debt is paid. He gave a sharp, jerky nod, his face pale and set. Go, now. The east cellar is 2 levels down. Look for the cask marked with the Shadowfen crest. The loose stone is 3 spans to the right of it, at eye level. He turned and began his patrol without another word, his footsteps echoing on the stone, each one a tick of a clock that had just started counting down. Ardell didn't hesitate. She melted back into the shadows of the corridor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She moved with a predator's grace, her senses on high alert. The Citadel was her home. She knew its arteries and veins better than anyone, but tonight it felt like an enemy's fortress. Every shadow could hold a guard. Every corner could hide a witness. The cellars were a labyrinth of stone and damp earth, the air thick with the smell of aging wine, salted meats, and the cold, mineral scent of the mountain's deep places. Torchlight was sparse here, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. She found the cask with the Shadowfen crest, its dark wood damp to the touch, 3 spans to the right. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn stone wall, searching for the telltale seam. There, a slight give under her palm, she worked her nails into the crack, prying the stone loose. It came away with a soft scraping sound, revealing a dark cavity. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against cold, rusted iron. The key. It was heavy in her hand, an old, ornate thing. The service tunnel entrance was just as Kalen had described. A low, iron-banded door disguised as part of a wine rack. The lock was stiff from disuse, groaning in protest as she turned the key. The sound was deafening in the silence. She froze, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. She pulled the door open just enough to slip through and closed it silently behind her. The tunnel was pitch black and claustrophobic. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was a narrow passage, the stone wall slick with moisture. She moved by touch alone, one hand trailing along the wall, the other held out in front of her. The stone floor was uneven, and she had to navigate carefully to keep from stumbling. The silence in here was absolute, a crushing weight that amplified the sound of her own breathing, her own pulse. Down here, beneath the feasting and the fires, was the true heart of the king's power, cold, dark, and merciless. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it. A faint line of orange light under a door at the far end of the tunnel, the lower passageway. She pressed her ear to the thick wood, listening. She could hear the slow, heavy tread of a single guard pacing back and forth. She waited, counting his steps, timing his route. He would pass the door, walk 20 paces to the end of the hall, turn, and walk back. She had a window of perhaps 15 seconds. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. As soon as his footsteps began to recede, she lifted the iron latch on her side of the door. It was shockingly loud. She eased the door open a crack. The corridor outside was empty, lit by a single sputtering torch that cast the stone in a hellish red glow. The air here was different, carrying the foul stench of unwashed bodies, despair, and stale blood. This was the antechamber to the black cells. She slipped out, closing the tunnel door behind her, and flattened herself into a shadowed alcove. The guard reached the end of his patrol and turned. It was a man she didn't recognize, his face brutish and dull. He walked past her hiding place without a second glance, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The moment he passed, she moved. The solitary cells were at the very end of the corridor, a row of reinforced doors, each with a small barred window at eye level. Tavian's scent, faint but sharp with agony and rage, pulled her forward. It was coming from the last cell on the left, the heaviest door, the one reserved for the worst traitors. She reached it, her breath catching in her throat. She peered through the grate. The cell was a lightless pit. For a moment she thought it was empty. Then a shape stirred in the far corner. A heap of rags and misery. "Tavian," she whispered, her voice cracking. The shape jerked, then slowly untangled itself. He crawled from the shadows into the sliver of torchlight that bled through the bars. His face was bruised, a fresh cut weeping blood on his cheekbone. But his eyes, when they found hers, were blazing with a fierce, desperate light. "Ardell," he rasped, his voice raw. He lunged for the door, his hands gripping the iron bars, the chains on his wrists clanking a grim music. "How did you get here? You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "I had to see you," she said, pressing her face closer to the bars, trying to ignore the cold iron against her skin. "Your message in the square." "Tavian, what happened?" "The king said you were with the insurgents." A harsh, broken laugh escaped him. "The king says many things. He's been weaving this lie for 3 years. He shook his head, his eyes burning into hers. "There was no raid, Ardell. My patrol. We were ambushed, yes, but not by insurgents. It was the Royal Guard, his Royal Guard. Men wearing the Valahurst crest, their faces hidden by their helms." The blood drained from Ardell's face. "No. Why? It makes no sense." "It does if you know what we found," he said, his voice dropping lower, laced with a terrifying urgency. "We were tracking a band of poachers, but we stumbled onto something else. A hidden mining camp, deep in the Shadowfen. They weren't mining iron or silver, Ardell. It was blightstone. Blightstone." The word was a curse, a volatile, poisonous rock that warped the earth and any living thing that came too close to it. Its use was forbidden by the oldest laws of the Pax, a taboo punishable by death. It was rumored to drive wolves mad, to twist their bodies into monstrous forms. "The king's personal sigil was on the supply crates," Tavian continued, his knuckles white on the bars. "He's been mining it in secret, stockpiling it. For what? I don't know. A weapon? A poison? We didn't have time to find out. His guards were on us within the hour. They killed Jorik and Finn without a word. They were going to kill me, but one of them, I think it was Corbin. He said the king might have a use for me. Corbin, the king's loyal shadow, the man who had brought her wine and warnings." A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "They took me to the camp." Tavian's voice was ragged with the memory. "For 3 years, I've been their prisoner. Not in a cell, but in the mines. They broke my leg so I couldn't run. They worked me like an animal, starved me, tried to break my spirit. They wanted me to turn, to swear fealty to whatever dark plan Roderick is hatching. When I refused, they brought in other prisoners. Wolves who had questioned the king, who had seen things they shouldn't have. They forced us to fight each other for scraps of food." Ardell felt sick. The king she served, the man who spoke of honor and unity, was running a secret gulag, forcing his own people into monstrous acts. When his war with the border clan started going badly, Tavian said, he needed a scapegoat, a story, so he dragged me out, branded me an insurgent, and created this narrative of me leading a rebellion from the marshes. It's all a lie, Ardell, a performance to consolidate his power and hide his true crimes. She pressed her forehead against the cold bars, her world fracturing. It was all too monstrous to be real, yet it fit together with a chilling, perfect logic. The king's new scar, not a battle wound, but perhaps a mining accident. His obsession with purging the poison from the lands, a projection of his own corruption. "Why didn't you tell them?" she whispered. "When they interrogated you?" "And tell them what?" he asked, his voice bitter. "The location of their own secret mine? The crimes they already know they committed? Their questions were a sham, a test. They wanted to see if I had broken, if I would finally play along with their story. My only weapon, the only thing I have left, is the truth, and I would only give it to you." The frayed thread of their bond pulsed between them. A current of shared pain and fierce, defiant love. He was gaunt and broken, but the man she loved was still there, his spirit an unquenchable fire. "I will get you out," she vowed, her voice thick with emotion. "I swear it." "No," he said, his voice sharp. He reached through the bars, his fingers brushing her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to her soul. "You can't. You'll die trying. He's watching you, Ardell. You must play the part. Pretend to believe him. Be the grieving mate, the loyal strategist. Be the Fenrite fox. That is the only way you survive. I will not leave you here to rot." "You won't," he insisted, his umber eyes pleading with her. "My purpose now is to buy you time. I will endure whatever they do to me, but you must find proof. The mine, shipment records, a witness, something you can take to the other alphas, something that will shatter his throne of lies. You are the only one who can do it. You are the only one he might not suspect if you play your part perfectly." Footsteps, heavy, approaching. The guard was returning early. "Go," Tavian hissed, his hand dropping from her face. "Now, don't let them find you. Live, Ardell, live and remember." He backed away from the door, melting into the darkness of his cell just as her heart was breaking. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave him, she couldn't. But his words were a commander's order. Live and remember. She forced herself to turn, to run. She flew back down the corridor, her feet silent on the stone. She slipped back into the service tunnel just as the guard's torchlight rounded the corner, casting a long, probing beam down the hall. She didn't breathe until the tunnel door was closed and latched, plunging her back into absolute darkness. Her gilded cage was no longer the citadel. It was the role she now had to play, every single day, under the watchful eye of a monster who wore a crown. Ardell made it back to her chambers with seconds to spare. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs, and the stench of the cells, damp stone and despair, clung to her like a shroud. She ripped off the morning gown, scrubbing her skin with cold water at the basin, trying to wash away the feeling of the bars on her face, the phantom touch of Tavian's fingers on her cheek. Kaelin had bought her the truth, and now she was shackled to it as surely as Tavian was shackled to the wall of his cell. Live and remember. His words were her new creed, her battle plan. She forced herself into a state of cold, calculated calm. The Fenrite fox had to hunt now, and the prey was a king. Tavian was right. A direct accusation was suicide. She needed proof, something undeniable that she could lay before the pack alphas. They were honorable wolves for the most part, but they were also pragmatic. They would not move against a victorious alpha king on the word of a branded traitor alone. They needed a crack in the crown, a flaw in the granite facade of Roderick Valhurst's rule, that they could see with their own eyes. Her mind, honed by years of mapping campaigns, began to map the Citadel's inner workings. Where would records of a secret mining operation be kept? Not in the public archives. Roderick was too cunning for that. They would be hidden, likely in his private study or under Corbin's direct supervision. Getting into either of those places was nearly as impossible as freeing Tavian himself. A witness, then. Tavian had mentioned other prisoners. Were any still alive? Had any been released, their minds broken, their tongues silenced by fear? It was a thread, but a frayed and tenuous one. Her best, most immediate option was the mine itself, the Shadow Fen marshes, a vast treacherous swamp on the kingdom's northeastern border, largely considered uninhabitable, a perfect place to hide a secret. She needed maps, patrol rosters, supply ledgers, anything that might show an unusual concentration of resources or manpower in that region, and all of that information was housed in one place, the Citadel's strategy room, her domain. The next morning, she was there before sunrise. The room was a high-vaulted chamber, its walls lined with maps, its great central table a sea of carved wooden markers representing battalions, supply depots, and scout patrols. The air smelled of old parchment, ink, and beeswax. This room was her sanctuary, the one place her authority was absolute. Today it felt like the heart of the conspiracy. She worked with a feverish, focused energy, masking her true purpose under the guise of post-war logistical planning. She pulled the supply ledgers for the past 3 years, citing the need to account for wartime expenditures. She spread out the geological surveys of the entire kingdom, claiming she was looking for new iron deposits to replenish their depleted armories. Hours passed. Warriors and quartermasters came and went, giving their reports, asking for her guidance. She was flawless in her performance. Her voice was steady, her questions sharp, her demeanor that of the unshakable strategist Fenright. Inside, her nerves were screaming. With every ledger she opened, she expected to find nothing, or worse, to have Corbin walk in, his shrewd eyes seeing straight through her deception. Late in the afternoon, she found it. It was a tiny discrepancy, a single line in a massive leather-bound book detailing grain shipments. A recurring significant allocation of grain and salted meat was being diverted to a forward operating base on the edge of the Shadowfen, a base that, according to the official military maps, had been decommissioned 4 years ago. It was listed under the unassuming heading, Geological Survey Team 7. There was no Survey Team 7. Her blood ran cold. This was it, the first thread. It wasn't proof, but it was a trail. She carefully committed the shipment numbers, dates, and routes to memory. She could not risk making a copy. Any alteration to the archives could be discovered. Just as she was carefully replacing the ledger, the doors to the strategy room opened. King Roderick stood there, flanked by 2 of his royal guard. He was dressed not in his formal court attire, but in practical leather and wool, as if for a journey. The scent of pine and cold iron filled the room, and Ardell had to fight the primal urge to snarl. "Strategist," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A moment." She inclined her head, her face a serene mask. "Your Majesty, I was just reviewing our supply readiness for the coming season." "Excellent," he said, walking into the room. His eyes swept over the maps on the table, the open ledgers. He was a wolf sniffing the air for a threat. "Your diligence is, as always, a credit to the kingdom." He paused, his gaze lingering on the geological surveys. "An interesting choice of reading material." "Resources win wars, Your Majesty," she replied smoothly. "Our iron mines in the north are running thin. I am exploring alternatives." Indeed, he picked up a small wooden marker, a carved wolf representing one of his battalions, and turned it over in his large hands. "I am riding out. An inspection of the border forts. Corbin will remain here, in command of the citadel." His eyes, hard as obsidian chips, met hers. "He will be handling the final interrogation of the prisoner, Marrow." The casual cruelty of the statement was a physical blow. He was telling her Tavian's fate was now in the hands of the very man who had overseen his capture and torture for 3 years. He was testing her, waiting for her to break, to plead, to reveal her hand. Ardell forced herself to breathe, to think. This was an opportunity, a dangerous, double-edged one. With the king gone, the citadel would be less watchful. But Corbin was arguably more dangerous, a zealot where Roderick was a pragmatist. "A wise decision, Your Majesty," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "Our border defenses must be our priority." She allowed a flicker of pain to cross her features, a carefully crafted moment of vulnerability. "As for the prisoner, I trust in your judgment. The man I knew is gone. It is my duty to accept that." A flicker of something, satisfaction, triumph, showed in the king's eyes. He had his answer. He believed he had broken her. He had reasserted his dominance, and she had bent the knee. "Good," he said, placing the marker back on the map with a decisive click. "I knew I could count on your reason to overcome your sentiment. Continue your work, strategist." He turned and strode from the room, his guards falling into step behind him. The moment he was gone, Ardell sank onto a stool, her legs trembling. The sheer force of his will was suffocating. Playing this game was like walking a tightrope over a canyon. And the rope was on fire. The king was gone. She had a lead. Now she needed to act. Her plan formed quickly, a desperate gambit born of necessity. She needed a messenger, someone utterly trustworthy who could get a message to the one man who might help her. Ganon, the reclusive alpha of the Stonemaul pack. His territory bordered the Shadowfen marshes. Gannon was old, fiercely independent, and had a long-standing distrust of Roderick's ambition. He had also been a close friend of Ardell's father. He would not act on her word alone, but he might be willing to investigate a suspicious report from his neighbor's lands. She couldn't use a royal courier. Corbin would read the message. She had to use someone outside the system. She thought of the kitchens, of the merchants in the lower city, and her mind settled on a young boy named Pip, a scullery lad who was clever, quick, and most importantly, invisible to the eyes of the court. She scribbled a coded message on a tiny scrap of parchment, using a cipher she and Gannon had devised years ago for communicating sensitive strategies. It didn't mention Blightstone or the king. It simply asked him to investigate unusual activity from Survey Team 7 near the old quarry, and warned that their geological samples were highly volatile. It was enough. Gannon would understand the implications. She found Pip in the steaming chaos of the main kitchen, scrubbing a massive cauldron. She pressed the message and a heavy gold coin into his small, chapped hand. "This is for Alpha Gannon of the Stonewall Pack," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "No one can see you leave. No one can know you carry this. Your life, and the lives of others, depends on your silence and your speed. Can you do this?" The boy's eyes, wide and serious, met hers. He looked from the coin to her face, and in that moment, he saw not a great lady of the court, but a she-wolf desperate and dangerous. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and palmed the message and the coin, making them disappear. He would not fail. One piece was in motion, but it wouldn't be enough. Gannon's investigation would take time. Time Tavian didn't have. Corbin was now in charge of his interrogation. She knew what that meant. It wasn't about getting information. It was about breaking him completely, torturing him until he confessed to the king's lies or died. She had to stop it. That night, a storm of a different kind broke over the citadel. A fire. It started in the West Wing, in a tapestry storage room, a place filled with dry, flammable material. Alarms screamed through the stone halls. Guards shouted, boots thundered on the stairs, and the organized chaos of an emergency response filled the air. In the midst of the confusion, a lone figure dressed in the dark gray of a castle servant, a hood pulled low over her face, slipped unnoticed towards the dungeons. Ardell had set the fire herself, using a simple but effective combination of oil and a slow-burning fuse. It was a massive risk, a destructive, chaotic act, but it was the only way to pull the bulk of the Citadel Guard, including Warden Bourne and his men, away from their posts. She reached the lower passageway. It was deserted, the single torch flickering, casting frantic shadows. This time, she didn't hesitate. She moved to Tavian's cell. "Tavian!" she hissed through the bars. He was there in an instant, his face grim. "Ardell, what is this? I can smell the smoke." "A diversion," she said quickly, her eyes scanning the empty corridor. "Corbin is planning to interrogate you. I'm getting you out." "No," he said, shaking his head fiercely. "It's too risky. You'll be caught. This is what Roderick wants. He wants you to do something reckless, to expose yourself." "I sent a message to Gannon," she countered, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "He'll investigate the mine, but I need to buy him time. I can't let Corbin break you before help arrives." She looked at the massive lock on his cell door. It was beyond her ability to pick. "Where do they take you for interrogation?" "The lower chamber," he said, a shadow passing over his face, past the main guard room. "Then that's where we'll set our trap," she said, her mind racing. "When they come for you, you will not fight them. You will go." She saw the protest in his eyes and held up a hand. "Trust me, Tavian. Just as I trust you, I am the strategist. Let me command this battle." She pulled a small, sharp object from her sleeve, a shard of obsidian she had taken from a geological sample in the strategy room. "When they take you, I will create another diversion. In that moment, I need you to get your hands on this." She pressed the sharp sliver of rock into his palm through the bars, her fingers closing over his. The brief touch was a bolt of lightning, a promise in the dark. "Aim for Corbin, not to kill, to wound, to mark him, create chaos. I will do the rest." A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked from the obsidian in his hand to her face. his umber eyes filled with a terrifying mix of love and fear. He nodded slowly. "Be careful, Ardell." "Foxes are always careful," she whispered back, a grim smile touching her lips. "Now, get back in the shadows, and be ready." The smoke was a bitter ghost that haunted the Citadel's corridors, long after the last flame was extinguished. It stung the eyes, clawed at the throat, and clung to the tapestries, a constant, acrid reminder of the night's chaos. Ardell moved through the aftermath, her face a carefully constructed mask of concern, offering calm advice to panicked servants and directing weary guards. She was the picture of order in the midst of disruption, the strategist Fenright reasserting control. Inside, her entire being was a single silent scream of anticipation. The first part of her gambit had succeeded. Now came the true test. Corbin was a storm cloud of fury. Ardell saw him near the scorched west wing, his face dark with suspicion, his scent sharp with anger. He barked orders, his voice tight with controlled rage. He knew the fire was no accident. She could see the knowledge in the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the crowds, searching for the culprit. He looked right at her, his gaze lingering for a heart-stopping moment, but her expression was one of cool, professional assessment. She was evaluating damages, a strategist counting the cost. He could prove nothing. His failure to find a target for his rage only made him more dangerous. His frustration curdled into a vicious, focused cruelty. "The prisoner," he snarled to the guards beside him, his voice low but carrying in the tense quiet. "The fire has delayed his confession long enough. Bring him to the lower chamber, now. I will have the truth from him before the sun rises, even if I have to peel it from his bones." It was the signal. Ardell's heart gave a single, hard thud. She gave a final instruction to a guard captain about securing the wing, and then turned, her movements unhurried, and headed towards the central keep. Her feint was a plausible one. She sought out Warden Boren, who was overseeing the cleanup near the dungeons, his face smudged with soot. "Warden," she said, her tone crisp. "Beta Corbin's orders are to move the prisoner. Given the instability of the night, I want to personally inspect the structural integrity of the lower chamber. A fire in one wing can compromise stone in another. I will not have a collapse on our hands." Boren, his mind dull with exhaustion and too much wine from the feast, simply grunted his assent. Her authority in matters of Citadel logistics was unquestioned. It was the perfect cover. He waved a hand, dismissing her, and she descended into the cold, familiar quiet of the lower levels. The interrogation chamber was even worse than she had imagined. It was a place stripped of everything but function. The stone walls seemed to sweat. The air was frigid, and a single torch cast a sickly, wavering light. In the center of the room was a heavy stone slab with iron manacles bolted to its surface. A rack of grim-looking instruments hung on the far wall, their shapes mercifully obscured by the shadows. This was a room designed to break minds and bodies. The thought of Tavian chained to that slab sent a wave of nausea through her. She had to focus. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for her weapon, for the second diversion. She found it on a high, dusty shelf built into an alcove. A collection of old clay jugs. She recognized the faint, greasy scent immediately. It was rendered whale oil, used for the torches, highly flammable. The wooden shelf was old, its supports grimed with age. Perfect. She moved to the far side of the room, pretending to inspect the mortar between the stones. Out of sight of the doorway, she worked quickly. She pulled a thin dirk from the sheath hidden in her boot and used its tip to pry at the iron bracket holding the right side of the shelf. The old metal was soft, corroded. It groaned but gave way. The shelf now rested precariously on its left bracket, and the crumbling lip of the stone alcove. A solid jolt to the wall nearby would be enough to bring it all crashing down. Her trap was set. She was examining a harmless crack in the floor when she heard the footsteps. 2 guards marched Tavian in, his arms wrenched behind his back. Corbin followed close behind, his presence sucking all the air from the small chamber. Tavian was pale, his breathing shallow, but his head was high. He saw her, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes widened in alarm, but he masked it instantly, his face settling into a stony mask of defiance. The obsidian shard was gone, hidden somewhere on his person. Lady Ardell, Corbin said, his voice dripping with false surprise. Losing your way in the dark? Inspecting the damage, Beta, she replied, her voice level. I'll be out of your way in a moment. No, stay, he purred, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He nodded to the guards. Put him on the slab. They forced Tavian onto the stone table, the clang of the iron manacles locking around his wrists, echoing in the terrible silence. Perhaps the presence of his mate will loosen his tongue. Let him see what his stubbornness costs you. Let him hear you when he makes you weep. It was a vile taunt, meant to unnerve them both. Tavian strained against his bonds, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. His eyes, burning with pure hatred, were locked on Corbin. Ardell held her ground, forcing a look of pained resignation onto her face. He is not the man I knew. Do what you must. Every word was a lie that tasted like poison, a betrayal that served a greater purpose. Corbin laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, I will. He picked up a long, thin-bladed knife from the rack, its edge glinting in the torchlight. He walked over to Tavian, tracing the line of his jaw with the tip of the blade. The king is a sentimental man. He wanted you broken. I, however, believe some things are too flawed to fix. They must simply be discarded. This wasn't an interrogation. It was an execution. Roderick had left orders for Corbin to dispose of the inconvenience that was Tavian Marrow. Ardell's blood ran ice cold. Her plan had to work. It had to work now. Corbin raised the knife. Ardell moved. Wait, she cried out, her voice sharp with what sounded like a last desperate plea. As Corbin turned his head towards her, annoyed by the interruption, she took 3 steps back and stumbled, throwing her entire weight against the wall right beside the alcove. The impact was a dull thud of stone on stone. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, the overburdened shelf gave way. The clay jugs tipped, toppling over one another in a slow-motion cascade of destruction. They shattered on the stone floor, disgorging a thick, greasy river of oil that spread rapidly, its surface gleaming in the torchlight. It flowed directly towards the single-torch sconce near the door. Foolish woman, Corbin roared, turning towards her, but it was too late. The first tendrils of oil reached the base of the sconce where embers had dripped. With a sudden, violent whoosh, the room erupted in a wall of fire. The flames shot up to the ceiling, feeding on the oil-soaked floor, a roaring, hungry beast of orange and black. The guards yelled in panic, stumbling back from the intense heat, blinded by the smoke that instantly filled the chamber. Chaos reigned, and in that chaos, Tavian acted. As the guard's attention was torn away, he brought his chained hands up and then slammed them down, using the weight of the iron to shatter the edge of the stone slab. He worked the shard of obsidian into his grip. With a powerful, desperate wrench, he sliced through the thick leather strap that anchored one of the manacles to the table. He was half free. He vaulted off the slab, a chained animal let loose, and launched himself not at the guards, but at Corbin. The beta, caught between the fire and this sudden attack, barely had time to raise an arm. Tavian was a blur of righteous fury. He was weaker, wounded, but he fought with the strength of a man with nothing left to lose. He slammed into Corbin, sending them both crashing against the far wall. The knife clattered to the floor. Ardell watched, her heart in her throat, as they grappled in the smoke and flickering firelight. It was a primal, brutal dance. She saw the glint of the obsidian shard in Tavian's hand. He wasn't trying to kill Corbin. He was disarming him, creating an opening. As Corbin delivered a stunning blow to Tavian's ribs, Tavian used the momentum to bring his hand up, slicing the sharp shard across Corbin's face. It was a deep, vicious gash, from the corner of his eye down to his chin, a mirror image of the king's own scar. Corbin screamed, a sound of pure agony and rage, clutching his face as blood streamed through his fingers. He staggered back, momentarily blinded. It was the opening they needed, but the guards were recovering from the initial shock. They drew their swords, their faces grim, advancing on Tavian, penning him in against the wall. He was trapped, his brief, violent freedom already at an end. He met Ardell's eyes through the swirling smoke, and she saw no fear in them, only a fierce, burning love. He had bought her the time. He had done his part. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let them drag him back to a fate worse than death at the hands of a wounded, vengeful Corbin. Her carefully constructed mask, her strategy of subtlety, burned away in the heat of the fire. There was no more playing the part. One of the guards, disoriented by the smoke, had dropped his sword near her feet. Without a second's thought, she bent and snatched it up. The weight of the steel was unfamiliar but grounding. She didn't charge. She didn't scream. She stepped out of the shadows, her gray eyes glittering like chips of ice in the firelight, and leveled the point of the blade at Corbin's chest. The advancing guards froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Corbin, clutching his bleeding face, stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet strategist, the grieving mate, was gone. In her place stood a warrior queen. "Enough," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with an absolute authority that cut through the crackle of the flames. The room fell silent. "Ardell, what is this madness?" Corbin snarled through a mask of blood. "This is treason." "No," she replied, her voice as cold and sharp as the sword she held. "This is the end of lies." She took a step forward, positioning herself between the guards and Tavian, a wolf defending her mate. "He is not a traitor, he is a witness." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting them see the utter conviction on her face. Then she delivered the final fatal blow to their entire world. "And so am I." The word hung in the fire-sucked air, more shocking than the flames, more final than a death sentence. Witness. For a long moment, no one moved. They were frozen in a tableau of smoke and blood and disbelief. The two guards, caught between the king's beta and the king's strategist, were paralyzed with indecision. Corbin's one good eye widened, first in shock, then in a dawning, murderous comprehension. The game was over. The fox had shown her teeth. "Seize them both," Corbin roared, spitting a spray of blood. "They are traitors, the both of them. Seize them now, or you will hang beside them." That was the command the guards understood. Fear of the king's wrath was a more immediate threat than Ardell's newfound defiance. They raised their swords, their expressions hardening into grim duty, and advanced. Ardell knew they had seconds, not minutes. She didn't retreat. She advanced, her borrowed sword held steady, a perfect extension of her will. She was not a trained swordswoman, but she was a strategist. She knew angles, knew leverage, knew the precise point where a structure would break. "Tavian, the door," she commanded, her eyes never leaving the guards. He didn't need to be told twice. While the guard's attention was on her, he lunged for the exit, a chained wraith moving with desperate speed. One guard turned to intercept him, and in that instant, Ardell struck. She didn't try for a killing blow. She drove the pommel of her sword hard into the second guard's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and he howled, his sword clattering to the floor. The first guard hesitated, torn between his two targets. It was the only opening Tavian needed. He slammed his shoulder into the man, sending him stumbling back into the wall of fire. The guard screamed as his tunic caught light, frantically beating at the flames. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the odds had shifted. Now it was just Corbin. He stared at Ardell, his face a grotesque mask of blood and fury. He lunged for the knife he'd dropped earlier, but Ardell was faster. She kicked it, sending it skittering into the darkest corner of the room. "It's over, Corbin," she said, her voice calm amidst the roar of the fire. "It's just beginning," he snarled. He was bigger, stronger, a seasoned warrior. Even unarmed and wounded, he was a lethal threat. He charged her, his hands shaped into claws, aiming to disarm her, to break her. She didn't meet his charge head-on. She sidestepped at the last possible second, just as she would plot a battalion's flanking maneuver. As he blundered past, she brought her sword around in a flat arc, the blade slapping hard against the back of his knees. His legs buckled, and he went down with a grunt of pain and surprise. Before he could recover, Tavian was there, bringing the length of his broken chain down like a whip across Corbin's shoulders. The beta collapsed onto the stone floor, stunned. There was no time for triumph. The fire was consuming the room, the smoke becoming a thick, choking blanket. "Come on," Tavian yelled, grabbing her arm. His touch was a jolt of pure, undiluted life. Together they scrambled out of the interrogation chamber and slammed the heavy iron door shut, trapping the fire and the groaning, defeated Beta inside. The corridors were still in chaos from the first fire, which gave them the cover they needed. They moved through the lower levels, a strange pair, the strategist in her soot-stained servant's disguise, and the escaped prisoner in his rags and chains. Adrenaline was afire in Ardell's veins. Every decision she had made, every rule she had broken, had led to this moment. There was no going back. They were fugitives in their own home. "Where are we going?" Tavian asked, his voice raw from the smoke. "Out," she said. "The king is gone. Corbin is incapacitated. This is our only chance to get clear of the citadel before the entire guard is mobilized against us." She led him not towards the main gates, but deeper towards the old servants' passages she knew from her childhood explorations. They came to a dead end, a solid stone wall. "Here," she said, pushing against a section that looked no different from the rest. With a low groan of grinding stone, a hidden door swung inward, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that led up into darkness. "This will take us to the old aviary in the West Tower. It's been abandoned for years." The climb was grueling. Tavian was weakened, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he never faltered. He was driven by a will that had refused to break for 3 long years. When they finally emerged into the aviary, the cool night air was a blessing. The circular room was open to the sky, its domed roof long since collapsed. Below them, the citadel was a hive of frantic activity, torches moving like fireflies as the guards tried to make sense of the second alarm. "From here, we can get to the outer wall," Ardell said, pointing to a crumbling parapet. "And then down into the forest." "And then what, Ardell?" Tavian asked, his voice quiet. He came to stand beside her, his chained wrist brushing against her arm. "We run? We spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" "No," she said, turning to face him. In the pale moonlight, the scars on his face were silver lines, testaments to his endurance. "We go to Gannon. My message should have reached him by now. If he's the man my father believed he was, he's already investigating. When he finds the mine, when he sees the Blightstone with his own eyes, he will listen. He has to." "Gannon is one alpha," Tavian countered, his gaze intense. "Roderick has the loyalty of a dozen others, bought with the spoils of his war." "Then we give them a reason to question that loyalty," she said, her strategist's mind clicking into place, seeing the battlefield with a stark new clarity. "Roderick's power is built on a lie, the lie that he is the perfect, victorious protector. We are going to shatter that lie. You are living proof of his cruelty. And Corbin." A grim smile touched her lips. "I gave him a gift, a scar identical to the king's. When Roderick returns, every wolf who looks at his beta will see the king's reflection, and they will be reminded of a story that no longer makes sense. Doubt is a seed, Tavian. We have planted it. Now we need to water it with the truth." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and profound love. "The Fenrite fox," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his free hand gently touching her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I knew you would not let them win." "Never," she whispered. The frayed bond between them, stretched and tortured for so long, now flared with a clean, bright heat. It was no longer just a bond of mates. It was the bond of comrades, of survivors, of 2 wolves united against the coming darkness. Their moment was broken by a sound from below, a single clear note from a war horn. It wasn't the sound of alarm. It was the signal for a rider's approach, a powerful rider, moving at speed. Ardell's blood ran cold. She looked out over the valley, towards the main road. A lone horseman was galloping towards the citadel, a black silhouette against the moonlit hills. Even at this distance, the aura of power, of absolute dominance, was unmistakable. "It can't be," she breathed. "He's back," Tavian said, his voice grim. "His inspection was a ruse. He must have suspected something. He was testing you, and he's returned to see if you failed." King Roderick Valhurst had come home to a fortress in chaos, his most trusted beta wounded and disgraced, and his two most dangerous prisoners gone. The hunt was about to begin. They scrambled onto the parapet, the stone loose and treacherous under their feet. The drop to the outer wall was perilous, but they had no choice. As they began to make their way across, the great doors of the citadel crashed open below. The king rode into the courtyard, his stallion rearing, its scream of fury echoing the rage on its master's face. He dismounted, his dark cloak swirling around him like a storm. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the walls, and Ardell knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was looking for them. His eyes, impossibly sharp, found them. Two small figures outlined against the moon on the highest, most remote tower. He didn't shout. He didn't raise an alarm. He simply lifted his head, and a low, guttural sound tore from his throat. It wasn't a human command. It was the growl of an alpha, a primal, possessive sound of pure, murderous rage that promised retribution. It was a promise of a death that would be slow and agonizing and absolute. The entire citadel guard froze, their heads turning as one towards the source of their alpha's fury. 100 pairs of eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, fixed on them. There was nowhere left to run. They were trapped on the wall, the forest a lifetime away, with the full might of the kingdom's wrath converging below. Tavian grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. His body was tense, ready for a final, hopeless battle. But Ardell looked down at the sheer drop, at the dark, waiting forest, and then back at the approaching tide of guards. A desperate, impossible idea took shape in her mind. A final, terrifying gambit. "He thinks he's trapped us," she whispered, her voice tight. "He thinks he has all the power." She squeezed Tavian's hand, her gray eyes locking with his umber ones, a silent question passing between them. A question of ultimate trust. He saw the wild spark in her eyes, the strategist seeing one last move on a board that was about to be wiped clean. He nodded slowly, his face grim but resolute. Always Fen right. She took a deep breath, the cold night air filling her lungs. Then, pulling him with her, she didn't run along the wall. She ran straight towards the edge. "For the truth," she yelled, her voice a clear, defiant cry that cut through the night. And together they leaped. The fall was a silent scream, a moment stretched into an eternity where the only realities were the wind tearing at their clothes and the unyielding grip of Tavian's hand in hers. Ardell didn't close her eyes. She watched the moonlit stones of the citadel rush up to meet them, a fortress determined to claim its dead. They were not aiming for the ground. That was certain death. They were aiming for the one thing that could save them. The deep, swift river that carved a channel along the western foundation, a churning artery of black water fed by the mountain's eternal snowmelt. They hit the water with a single, concussive impact that drove the air from their lungs and plunged them into a world of shocking, paralyzing cold. The current seized them immediately, a powerful, merciless hand that dragged them down, tumbling them over and over in the darkness. Ardell's lungs burned. Her limbs were leaden. The weight of Tavian's chains threatened to pull them both to the riverbed. For a terrifying second, she thought their desperate leap had only traded a swift death for a slow one. Then Tavian's arm was around her waist, his strength a primal anchor in the chaos. He fought the current, his legs kicking with a strength born of pure will, hauling them both towards the surface. They broke through with a simultaneous gasping breath, sucking in the precious frigid air. The citadel was already receding behind them, a dark monolith crowned with the frantic torches of the thwarted hunters. The river was their salvation and their tormentor. It carried them swiftly away from their pursuers, but it threatened to drown them with its icy power. They clung to each other, sharing what little body heat they had left, their only goal to keep their heads above the churning water. Tavian, with his one free hand, managed to snag a piece of driftwood, and they used it as a crude float, the rough bark digging into their numb fingers. Hours melted into a blur of cold, darkness, and grim endurance. The sounds of the hunt faded, replaced by the roar of the river and the whispering of the wind in the pines that lined the banks. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, The river had carried them miles downstream, deep into the wild heart of the forest. The current slackened as the river widened into a shallow bend, and with their last reserves of strength, they fought their way to the bank, collapsing onto a gravelly shore, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They lay there for a long time, listening to the sound of their own ragged breathing. They were alive, they were free, and they were utterly alone. Ardell sat up first, the wet rags of her disguise clinging to her skin. Her mind, slow and numb with cold, began to work again. They were exposed. Roderick's scouts would be scouring the riverbanks. They needed to find shelter, to get warm, to break Tavian's remaining chains. Ganon's territory, Tavian rasped, his voice hoarse. It should be north of here. A day's journey, maybe more. We won't survive a day like this, Ardell stated, her practical mind assessing their grim situation. She looked at the heavy iron cuffs still locked around his wrist. We need to get that off you. They found a pair of sharp-edged rocks and began the slow, arduous work. Tavian braced his arm against a fallen log while Ardell hammered at the chain, link by painful link. The sound of metal on metal was a sharp, dangerous counterpoint to the forest's quiet. With every strike, she felt a sliver of their old life breaking away. The strategist, the scout, the loyal subjects, they were all being hammered into something new, something wilder and more resilient. Finally, with a sharp crack, the last link gave way. Tavian was free of the king's iron. He flexed his wrist, rubbing the raw, chafed skin, his eyes never leaving Ardell's face. The silence that followed was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. He reached out, his hand gentle on her arm. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went deeper than gratitude. "You saved me first," she whispered back. "You gave me the truth." They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the hillside, shielded by a thicket of winter bear thorns. They huddled together for warmth, their shivering slowly subsiding as their bodies shared a desperate heat. There, in the dim light, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and pine, the last of the barriers between them crumbled. The years of grief, the terror, the desperate gambles, it all melted away, leaving only the pure, unbreakable core of their bond. He kissed her then, a kiss that was not of passion, but of profound homecoming. It was a reclaiming of all the sunrises they had lost, a promise of all the ones they would fight to see. It was the taste of survival, of hope, of a love that had been dragged through hell and had emerged, scarred but whole. Later that day, Pip the scullery boy, having run through the night with the speed of a frightened deer, found the camp of Alpha, Ganon. The old wolf, his face like a weathered crag of granite, listened to the boy's frantic story and read Ardell's coded message. His eyes, pale and shrewd, narrowed. He had never trusted the low-born Alpha who had clawed his way to the throne. This talk of volatile geological samples confirmed a darkness he had long suspected. He sent his swiftest scouts towards the Shadowfen, their orders simple: observe, report, and do not be seen. 2 days later, the scouts returned, their sense sharp with horror. They spoke of a hidden mine, of sick-looking guards with the king's crest, of a poisonous rock that seemed to drink the light from the air. They spoke of freshly dug graves. Ganon had his proof. He did not march on the capital. That would mean civil war. He was a strategist in his own right. He sent riders to the other northern Alphas, the ones who valued old laws and bloodlines over Roderick's new order of strength and fear. He sent them the scouts' reports, and he sent them Ardell's message. He did not ask them for war. He asked them for a council to judge a king. Meanwhile, in the capital, King Roderick's flawless narrative was cracking. Corbin, his face now a ruin of stitched flesh, was a living symbol of the official story's failure. Whispers spread like wildfire. How had a lone, starved prisoner managed to overpower the king's beta and 2 guards? And where was the strategist Fenright? The official story, that she had been a secret traitor all along, helping her mate, felt thin and hollow to those who knew her ironclad integrity. The seed of doubt Ardell had planted was sprouting in the dark soil of the citadel. 3 weeks later, on the first day of the spring thaw, the great packs convened on the neutral ground of the sunken plains. Alpha Ganon was there, flanked by the grim alphas of the north. King Roderick arrived in full regalia, his royal guard a shining sea of steel, his face a mask of cold fury. He came to quash a rebellion, to reassert his dominance. He did not expect the two figures who walked out of the forest to stand beside Ganon's throne. A murmur went through the assembled alphas. It was Tavian Marrow and Ardell Fenright. They were no longer the ragged fugitives who had leaped from the citadel wall. They were dressed in the simple leathers of the Stonemaul pack, but they carried themselves with an unshakable dignity. Tavian was still thin, but his eyes were clear, his scars a testament to the truth he carried. Ardell stood beside him, her golden hair braided back, her gray eyes missing nothing. She met the king's furious gaze without flinching. They told their story. Tavian spoke of the Blightstone, of the prison camp, of the murders. Ardell spoke of the lies, of the tampered ledgers, of the king who ruled through fear and deception. When they were finished, a heavy silence fell over the plains. Roderick laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "The ravings of a traitor and his deluded mate. Where is your proof?" "Here," Ganon said, his voice a low growl. His wolves brought forth a cart, and from it they rolled a single heavy crate bearing the king's sigil. They opened it, and even from a distance, the alphas could see the malevolent, light-sucking ore within. Blightstone, the tide had turned. Roderick's carefully built kingdom of lies crumbled in a single moment. His guards shifted uneasily. The alphas looked from the poisonous rock to the king, and they saw not a protector, but a desecrator of their most sacred laws. The judgment was swift and unanimous. Roderick Valahurst was stripped of his title, his crown, his pack. He was declared outcast, a lone wolf, the highest punishment for his crimes. He did not beg. He did not plead. He simply stared at Ardell, his eyes filled with a hatred that was as pure and cold as the Blightstone itself. Then he turned and walked away into the wilderness, a king no more. Ardell and Tavian did not return to the capital. Their old life was a ghost, a story that belonged to someone else. They chose to stay with the Stonemaul pack, in the wild, rugged lands of the north, where the air was clean and the law was simple. They found a small, abandoned cottage deep in the woods, near a place where the wild river bent, not far from where it had first delivered them to freedom. They rebuilt it with their own hands, stone by stone, log by log. Tavian taught Ardell the language of the forest, the track of the deer, the scent of the coming rain. She taught him the constellations, the histories of the old packs, the quiet strategies of patience and growth. The bond between them was no longer a thing of fire and desperation, but a deep, quiet certainty, as solid and enduring as the mountains that watched over them. They were two halves of a whole, forged in betrayal and tempered in rebellion, their scars a map of the journey that had finally brought them home. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ardell stood with Tavian by the riverbank, watching the water flow. The river that had almost claimed them now sang a song of peace. Her wolf, so long a silent prisoner of grief, was finally quiet, curled contentedly in the heart of her soul. She was no longer just the Fenright fox, the strategist. She was Ardell, his Ardell. And that, she realized as Tavian's arm slipped around her waist, was the only title she had ever truly wanted.